Back in 2016, not many pollsters correctly predicted Donald Trump's climb on his way to winning the White House. But that was just one in a long line of correct predictions made by Polly, the artificial intelligence algorithm. Erin Kelly is president and CEO of Advanced Symbolics, Inc., the Ottawa-based company that put Polly into action. And Erin Kelly joins us now from the nation's capital for the latest in the U.S. and some local issues too. Hi, Erin. So nice to have you here. Excited to hear what you're saying tonight. Last night it was supposed to be a debate, and then President Trump had the coronavirus, and then the debate commission suggested having a virtual debate, which he declined. Joe Biden decided to have a town hall, and then President Trump had a town hall on a competing network. All in one night. So we have a graphic here, and here's where the candidates stand. Biden is leading by a wide margin in both the Electoral College and popular vote. What does Polly have to say about the race for the presidency in the United States, Erin?
So we are definitely seeing Biden is far ahead as the map shows. And if you go to the map on our website, it's updated every day, and you can put your mouse over each state and see all of the issues and see what some of the sleeper issues might be for each candidate. But right now, we're only seeing about a 10% chance that Mr. Trump will be reelected as president. Now, he did have a bump after his bout with coronavirus. He went up about 20 electoral college votes, which was interesting. Now, the popular vote only changed by 1%, but we saw in some of those swing states, they liked seeing him pull through the coronavirus. This is a very big issue, especially in Florida, where the virus is raging and the population tends to be older. But he has since lost that lead with his behavior more recently. People see it as irresponsible. He's kind of jumped the shark a little bit with that. And we also saw that the debate, not having a debate, actually favors Joe Biden, interestingly enough.
That's interesting. Why is that?
Well, there's a meme, if you will, going around the United States, this sort of Sleepy Joe marketing that the Republicans have put out, and it has taken hold with people who wonder if Mr. Biden is too old, and there's a rumor that he's is not as sharp as he used to be. And in fact, he isn't as good on his feet and as good a debater as Mr. Trump. I mean, people can debate that, but he's not as quick as Mr. Trump. And so we found in the debates slightly favor Mr. Trump. So not having that and allowing Mr. Biden to speak and to address the nation would actually be favorable to him.
In 2016, a lot of polls show that Hillary Clinton would defeat Donald Trump. We know how that turned out. They were wrong. What are the challenges of polling during the race, during the 2016 presidential election?
Well, in the 2016 election, there were two main problems. Number one, people weren't willing to publicly say that they would say that they were endorsing Mr. Trump to their friends and online, and you can see it in what we call their digiographics, the things that they read and the things that they liked. But when pollsters would call, people didn't want to admit to a person on the phone or a person asking that they were going to vote for Mr. Trump because of the negative views of him being xenophobic and sexist and things like that. So they would tend to say they were undecided. But we could see, based on how people were behaving and what they were reading, that those people were leaning toward Mr. Trump. We also saw really interesting marketing going on. About halfway through the summer, old GOP, Grand Old Party supporters over 65 started to say that they were leaving the Republican field. And Hillary Clinton was very proactive in saying those people are coming to me. But that turned off some of the younger elements of the Democratic Party who saw Mrs. Clinton courting favor with older Republicans. So she lost some support of sort of the left-leaning Democrats. And then in the end, those people over 65 came back to Mr. Trump and those other people who were leaning Democratic stayed with Mr. Trump as well.
That is so fascinating because now the polls are suggesting that presidential candidate Biden is in the lead. Is there a path to victory for President Trump?
We're seeing less than 10% chance of that. Now, there are some sleeper issues. For example, if we get a vaccine or a credible treatment, not just a treatment that's for presidents, but a treatment for other, the general population that's credible, that would really do a lot to bolster Mr. Trump. If we see Joe Biden having Sleepy Joe moments where he looks to be not all there intellectually. If he stumbles or there's some sort of big moment like that, that's a sleeper issue for Mr. Biden. We also see that there is some concern that there are some left-wing radical elements in the Democratic Party, and if something were to come forward, because Americans aren't really keen on that, something would come forward to bolster that view, that could have a big impact on Mr. Biden as well.
I mean, the election is 2 weeks plus away, which is a lifetime in politics. When it comes to the lead up to an election, do you worry that poll results can shape public opinion, or in your view, are polls a reflection of public opinion?
Well, in my view, they're a reflection of public opinion, but it's definitely a big concern that they affect public opinion. And I think the political parties believe that. One of the reasons we don't work for political parties, we don't take contracts from political parties, is because often political parties will use these as weapons. And if you're working for a political party, they'll say, well, if the poll isn't favorable to my party, you can't publish or you can't speak to the media. And so definitely the parties believe that. I think there is evidence that that happens. In this particular case, I think Mr. Biden is so far ahead that it's not as much of an issue in this election.
Can Polly tell us anything about what issues are motivating American voters right now?
Yes, for sure. Now, the coronavirus is the number one issue right now, and if you go to the map, you can actually mouse over by state and see what all of the issues are. So that's the number one: lockdowns, the economy. Interestingly enough, the integrity of the election itself is a big concern with Americans, and this favors Mr. Trump. And here's why. People who are centrist or who are more likely to stay home probably would vote Biden if they showed up at the polls. But because the integrity of the election is being questioned, whether or not the ballots will be miscounted or whether the president will even accept the results, that motivates people who are on the fence to stay home. Because they say, why bother voting if it's not going to count or if it's going to be corrupt? And so the more we question the integrity of the election, the more we help Mr. Trump.
And we should mention that there's no evidence to suggest that that is happening. It's just something that's been put out by Trump's side, right?
It's rumors. Mm-hmm.
Right. Let's talk about Canada, Ontario to be more specific. What does Polly have to say about the way Premier Doug Ford has handled the pandemic?
Well, there's two very distinct points of opinion on that. So in March, when I was on the agenda, I said people were taking it quite well, and the premier was getting high points for his handling of the pandemic. We saw a sharp downturn in the first 2 weeks of October when the economy was shut down again, and not because the economy was shut down, but because people felt Mr. Ford took too long to shut down those hotspot regions in Toronto, Peel, and Ottawa. People are very upset, feel that the number of cases got much higher than it should have been, that he showed lower leadership. We saw negative comments about Mr. Ford increase by 60% over what they were in March. And people are also very upset about not having access to testing. They feel that people, because they're not getting tested, they're circulating in the population. People with runny noses that might have coronavirus are circulating in the population who shouldn't be, and the public is really demanding better testing. And there's definitely a strong feeling that the provincial government and Mr. Ford's government have mishandled this pandemic in the second surge.
We did see a lot of goodwill between the province and the federal government. But according to Polly, to what degree does the public hold the premiers more responsible for the pandemic than the prime minister?
Well, the prime minister's in a sweet spot, right? Because he's the one giving out the benefits and supporting Canadians. And it's the premiers and the public health bodies who are giving the bad news. You're not going to go trick-or-treating. We're closing down restaurants and pubs and doing the shutdown. So definitely the premiers and the heads of public health are taking a much bigger hit than the prime minister.
Has Polly noticed, because I know something that's been in the news a lot, return to school in September. Has Polly noticed a shift since school started towards the feelings towards the Conservative government here in Ontario?
Well, there was definitely a feeling. Now, people are supportive of the schools opening, so we're not seeing people being upset about that. I think there's general acceptance that children are not big spreaders of the virus. They can get the virus, but when they do, it tends to be mild. So people are much more concerned about the pubs and the bars than they are about the schools. But definitely, there's a feeling that we were not prepared for this opening. Especially with the testing, and a lot of questions about whether or not the schools are too crowded and things like that. But it's not as big an issue as other venues like pubs and restaurants.
Does Polly see a way forward for the Ontario government to maybe shift the perception of how they're handling the pandemic?
The public wants to see action taken earlier when hot zones are being identified. So the public definitely is putting faith in the scientists and the doctors and want to see the premier take strong action, even though it is difficult to shut down parts of the economy when we get into hot zones. They feel he has to do that. And lives are more important than the economy. And we're seeing that very clearly in the population. And more testing. People really want, and better understanding of how people, when people can take a test, how they get it, how long they have to wait. That's front and center right now.
It's a big weekend here for TVO. We have our telethon. And also it's a big weekend for you because TVO's original doc called Margin of Error is airing this Saturday at 9 p.m. Let's take a look. Sheldon, please roll.
I think AI tests the myths of neutrality when it comes to the political process.
Meet Polly, an AI algorithm programmed to predict the 2019 election.
We have found that for elections, we get the strongest signal from Twitter.
So that means we've got information from all over the place.
Now we have the opportunity to evolve this science for the first time in 50 years.
What is Polly telling you about the fallout from all of this?
So when you connect all that data together, it's remarkable the intimate picture it paints of the individual.
The traditional pollsters are afraid of this because it's the future.
What was it like to have a documentary crew follow you around for this documentary process?
It was difficult too, because I'm not used to that, right? I'm used to working very much in a lab and a science lab. We're not used to that, and so you feel self-conscious, but we were excited to have the opportunity to show before the election happened how accurate Polly is.
What misconceptions do you think people still have about artificial intelligence?
I think there's a view out there that artificial intelligence is affecting the election or affecting the outcome. Very clearly, what we are doing is reading what the population wants, what is important to the population. And often what you find is at odds with what the politicians think people care about. And that's what I find most interesting. We see still politicians focusing on scandals and things like that. And what the AI shows is people aren't interested in that. People are a lot smarter than I think the politicians give them credit for. Mr. Ford will say he's communicating well to the public, but the public is reading a lot more than what just the politicians say. They're reading what the scientists are saying, and they're seeing disconnect. So we see that all the time in elections. If I could give one word of advice to politicians, it's to stay away from the scandals and stay on substantive issues.
I think it's because you use Twitter as a source of information to gauge how people are, what they're thinking about and what's important to them. Do you see a future for Polly maybe being able to get the data of people who might not be on social media to get an idea of what they think as well?
Well, here's the thing. The science says not everybody's on Twitter, not everybody's on Facebook, but you don't need them to be, because not everybody takes the poll either. Not everybody was part of the phone poll. And the whole idea behind statistics and representative sampling is that as long as the population that is there is representative of the whole, you don't need to get everybody. So we don't just look at Twitter. We can look at any kind of digital online, any kind of digital file, really. But it doesn't actually matter whether we're on this platform or that platform, as long as we are picking people for the sample who are representative of normal Canadians. So, and there's the algorithm is well set up to figure out what that looks like.
Something earlier when we were talking about the last U.S. presidential election, about people maybe not being as forthcoming about who they were swaying, if they were going to support President Trump. On social media, do you think people realize how many cookie crumbs that they're leaving for maybe someone like artificial intelligence to decipher where they really stand?
No, and it's important to understand too, we don't collect any names because we're not interested in individuals. We're looking at trends. But people aren't aware. So we don't violate anybody's privacy if you have privacy settings turned on. Uh, we respect that. But what people don't understand is when they post on other people's walls, that's not private, right? It's only your wall that's private. And so probably they're not aware of it. They probably think too, I think there's a lot of paranoia that people are collecting more information than they actually are. That would actually be overfitting data. So you really are just looking for trends to see. And it's important to understand too that most of this work is done for very pro-social reasons, almost all of it. For example, Poly has recently won a contract to do prediction of COVID cases in the province, which I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And we do a lot of work with health bodies trying to figure out where in mental health and in physical health, where pandemics are going to break out. That's what most of AI is used for. Statistics Canada gathers information to do better planning. As long as you're protecting individual privacy, which we do with k-anonymity and differential privacy, you want to be able to see what the population is really concerned about, because that's how you develop policy that addresses people's concerns. People aren't concerned about which politician is having an affair with who. They really care about their job, their health, their families. And so keeping politicians focused on that, I think, is a good thing.
It seems to be, just to jump off the point that you just made, that some people are kind of like Teflon. I think Trump has been referred to as being Teflon. Why don't scandals hurt him?
It's not that scandals don't hurt him. It's he's very targeted. Scandals don't hurt anybody, and that's what I really wish that I could impart to politicians. Stop trying to focus on his errant behavior. If people feel he's creating jobs, he's getting a cure for the coronavirus, and if they believe that, then they will vote for him. They don't care that he's cheating on his spouse or that he's not a great dad or whatever is going on in his personal life. They care about their own personal lives, and so a scandal wouldn't hurt anybody if it didn't affect the population or their ability to make policy. This is why the Sleepy Joe thing is important for Joe Biden, because it makes people think, well, he won't make good decisions when he is the president if he has this issue. So it really is dependent on the effect that it has on the population and not just the scandals of this individual.
Earlier on you mentioned that after President Trump was diagnosed with having coronavirus, that his polls actually went up. There was a bump of support for him. That is impacting people. At one point, he referred to it as a hoax. Why wouldn't that hurt him? Why would it help him?
Yeah, because he turned it into, and it's really important in how you communicate the scandal. In the case of his bounce back from the coronavirus, his messaging was, now that I've had these treatments, I can bring these treatments to you. And that resonated with people. But in his actions after that, when he was taking off his mask and holding rallies, people, again, his popularity came back down. But as long as people think that he can help them and that he can get a treatment in and that we can open up the economy, people want to rally around that. But if they think that he's irresponsible and that it's going to hurt public health, then he comes back down. So it's really about his impact on the population and not his own personal recovery or not.
You can correct me if I'm wrong. The 2016 election, was it 80% that Hillary Clinton would win to would go on to become president? It was pretty high, right?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact percentage. Remember, she did win the popular vote, so
by
that's
3 million
something
or
I
something,
try to remember.
Right?
She won the popular vote. The thing in the 2016 election was how that vote broke up in the electoral districts. That's where she lost.
So do you see a day where Pauly can completely predict election results with 100% accuracy?
Not if we get down to each riding or each electoral college district. I think that's, in the documentary you're going to see, in the last federal election, we got within 2 seats for the Liberals. That's pretty amazing. And 3 seats for the Conservatives. So when you're looking at over 300 ridings, 360 ridings or something, that was, pretty bang on. You always have that margin of error, as, the documentary title suggests. So We're pretty close now, but I think it would be hard to get 100%.
Just to go back on a comment that you made about this work that Polly is doing, why do you think people are still afraid of AI?
Well, I think because they don't understand it.
Mm.
It's a great unknown, and I think people think it can do more than it actually can. At the end of the day, the AI is a big pattern recognition machine. It's just doing what we could do with statistics, but doing it on a much larger scale. But she's not changing people's minds. People have their opinions, and the AI is not changing that. What she's doing is understanding what their concerns are. That's and how those concerns that they have impact how they vote.
Well, we're going to learn more about how Polly behaves and about AI this Saturday. As I said, Margin of Error is premiering, world premiere on TVO, 9 p.m. Erin Kelly, as always, it's been so great having you here, and I know we'll probably have you back before the election on November 3rd. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.